o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to the last of our conversations with Chicagoans who help us understand and interpret the city all around us. We'll be talking with Zac from the Edgar Miller Legacy this evening. There he is, saying hi to you, of course. Just wanted to introduce myself in case you haven't joined us before. Reintroduce myself in case you've seen my face in the past. I'm Alex Bean. I'm a big history nerd. Got some of that out of my system. Get in my master's from the University of Chicago. I also teach at the city colleges, and which starts class tomorrow, of course. And I do a lot of the writing and hosting, especially of events like this, for Chicago Detours, which is the group that's bringing you the conversation this evening. Founded 10 years ago this past summer by my former classmate Amanda. We've been leading walking tours and driving tours for most of our existence, but this year has forced us to change our circumstances. That's also let us change up our format a little bit, including fun conversations like this with Zac tonight. So just to remind you, I've sort of introduced myself. I'll turn it over to Zac in a minute here. He can kind of introduce himself and Edgar Miller Legacy. And then I've got some questions prepared. And if you've got questions that pop up while we're having our conversation, feel free to put them into the group chat. And I'll either ask them at an opportune moment during the conversation, or we'll try and make sure we have a few minutes at the end of our time together to make sure we get everybody's questions and comments accounted for. But with all of that being said, I will go ahead and turn it over to Zac, the guest of honor this evening.
Hey everybody, how's it going tonight? My name is Zac Bleicher. I'm the executive director of Edgar Miller Legacy. I notice a few familiar names and folks that I've met before, so welcome, good to see you, and also welcome to new folks who I haven't met before. Edgar Miller Legacy is an organization that I helped to found in 2014. It was really a project that was many decades in the making. Many other preservationists and collectors and historians had sort of saved Edgar Miller's history from almost the near dustbin. He was a famous artist in the mid-century in Chicago, and yet by the 1980s, he had been almost completely forgotten. And if it weren't for a couple of, quote, handmade homes in the Old Town neighborhood, it's not quite clear that his legacy would have been remembered as well. But these permanent architectural edifices that have been lived in and loved for many decades since they were built in the 1920s and 30s have really kept Miller's legacy going, and is what eventually caused him to reunite with the preservationists who were saving those buildings starting around the 1970s and 80s. And so Miller, who was born in 1899, actually was still alive in the 1980s and became friends and worked with many of the preservationists in the 1980s and 90s, and he died in 1993. And so this is all to say that over the decades, people have been really doing a lot of work to keep this history alive. But it wasn't until 2014 that we finally decided that we needed to really celebrate and preserve this artist's work in a more official, organized way. And one of the things that has just been so hard about Edgar Miller is that a lot of his art is embedded in buildings, and especially private buildings, private homes. And so it's a very difficult work to get to see. And part of our job of educating the public about Edgar Miller has been getting folks into these spaces so that you can see his work up close and really understand what a profoundly important artist and designer this Edgar Miller person was. So for a lot of folks who've grown up in Chicago or came to Chicago a long time ago, may have never heard of Edgar Miller in their lives. Then when they come and see the work, they go, oh my, how do I not know of this artist? Because it's just that great in terms of the work he did. He could work in over 30 different media. He was a real Renaissance man, and he was prolific. And so he painted, he drew, he sculpted, he made concrete molds and installed art on the side of the walls. He did stained glass. And he was also very involved in graphic design and advertising in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so a lot of his work influenced modern day advertising and graphic design. So really just an incredible artist. I know some of you have been to visit an Edgar Miller site before, or maybe come to one of our lectures or programs, all of which are now, of course, going online, or have gone online and will continue to be online probably until the foreseeable future. Simply, as I mentioned, many of the sites that we would take people into are private. And so while a regular museum may be able to open up during this time under very strict social distancing and health guidelines, we have our own challenges in terms of opening up spaces that are generally people's private spaces. And certainly during this time, it's difficult to get people in there. But one thing to look forward to, for instance, is there's a beautiful home that Edgar Miller designed called the Glasner Studio, which we had been giving tours of for some time, that we're now developing a virtual tour of, and you'll be able to see when that's fully developed later this fall. So things to look forward to. We also do online lectures, as I mentioned, and you can also find all of our lectures and past programs on our website. So if you go to edgarmiller.org, you'll be able to go and look at things that have been recorded and put in the past. And I can actually just show you all real quick. I think Alex gave me permission for this, yeah. So I'm just gonna, if you look on your screen now, this is our website. It's edgarmiller.org. And there's all kinds of great things here, like the library. If you click on that button, you can go to, for instance, the lecture archive. And this is where you can find out, what past lectures have been. For instance, Edgar Miller helped to do the art direction for the streets of Paris at the 1933-34 World's Fair, a little fun fact. And this takes you to that lecture presentation, which was in 2018 at the DePaul Art Museum. So lots of great stuff in here, and I definitely encourage you to check it out on your own. There's a lot of other great stuff we do too, like the Artist in Residency program that we were doing. We'll see, again, how we're going to be able to continue this during the COVID era, but this is a program where we wanted to connect up-and-coming artists in Chicago with Edgar Miller spaces, all of which were intended to be art colonies and art centers. In fact, they were for many decades. And so just to give an artist, like this one here, Luna Day, a chance to write and compose in the space and then perform. And these are some really great experiences that have happened over the past several years, thanks to the organization. And so that's just a little snippet of what we do, but I'm happy to take questions. I know Alex, I think, had some to begin with.
Yeah. And we had already gotten the question there. We had chatted about it a little bit before. I think most of the folks had joined us, but Trenton had asked where you're speaking from. He had noticed the windows behind you, which are very identifiable as Edgar Miller windows once you kind of pick out that style.
I am myself an inhabitant of an Edgar Miller space. And so that's one way in which I also appreciate Edgar Miller. My background, actually, I was someone who grew up around this. One of the preservationists of the 1970s and 80s was a relative of mine, my uncle. And I got to meet a lot of people involved, when I was a kid, who were doing the preservation work, artists and craftsmen like Bob Horn and Larry Zagoda, as well as Claudia Cleveland, Larry Colden, folks like that who are artists and who have done a lot of restoration work on the Miller buildings over the past many decades. And then, of course, there was Edgar Miller, who I barely got to meet. I was about this tall, and I got to meet him when he was 90 years old. So I can't say that, we had a lot of interaction, but I know he was friends with a lot of these folks, and it was such a wonderful thing to see and understand that here's an artist that really almost was forgotten, and then these preservationists and people who cared about that history got to know him and really hear the stories he had to tell, from the horse's mouth. And then that is probably why there's been more interest in preserving his work from then on was simply this emotional connection that a lot of folks had to the artist himself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know one of the things that, yeah, I've been familiar with some of Edgar Miller's work for years, but I think it was about 3 years ago, I think, that he really kind of, I think I wrote about him and just started discovering his work all over the place. And one of the things that really blew me away is how he's regarded now as sort of the founder of Old Town as we know it today. The sort of like artistic vibe of that neighborhood in a lot of ways goes back to his time creating those handmade homes on Carl Street and Wells Street. And so that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about. What is it that makes those handmade homes so different or so distinct and so important that a whole neighborhood would kind of grow up around them?
That's a great question. Yeah. And, you have to remember that before the 1940s and 50s, Old Town really didn't exist as a neighborhood called Old Town, and nor did it exist as a neighborhood with a lot of artists in it. It was really a working class German neighborhood north of North Avenue and predominantly Armenian south of North Avenue. It was called North Town, and so, named after North Avenue. And the artists were primarily living in a neighborhood called Tower Town, which was over by the water tower, and we now think of that as Michigan Avenue. And one thing that was starting there was, especially with Edgar Miller living in Tower Town, but other artists as well, was the idea of like artistically decorating your studio, or in Edgar Miller's case, he would actually do interior design work for other restaurants or other tea shops or things like that in Tower Town. So he already had this sense of space and material and how to really, do magic with an interior, exterior, and often using very cheap materials or found materials because these were artists and, they didn't have a lot of money. And what happened was his friend Saul Kogan went to Paris, saw them doing similar things around the 1920s there, and when he came back to Chicago, said, let's design these art colonies for our friends and our fellow artists, designers, and architects. And it's not quite clear why they picked that building on Burton Place. It was called Carl Street at the time, but Saul Kogan found this old home and asked his old friend Edgar Miller from art school, would you help me redesign this place into an art colony? And of course, Edgar Miller was such a, was just doing everything for the thrill of it and loved the opportunity to just start demolishing walls and using found tile and creating new windows and all kinds of design and execution work that he was doing himself with a group of helpers. And so that development, that project really was the beginning of using these found materials, using kind of all your artistic skills and bringing other artists into the project to totally reimagine a building as kind of an art compound. And this wasn't something that they invented. They saw images of this in Paris, or in Saul Kogan's case, he went to Paris and saw it. And they were doing this in other areas of the country in the United States. I think there's always been a real handmade, do-it-yourself kind of ethos in art creation in this country. And you can go all over places like Wisconsin, where you find these handmade grottos and these handmade homes by other kind of, artists or self-taught artists. And so this was in that tradition of that, mixed with Edgar Miller really being a professional designer, up and coming. I mean, he was already doing professional work. This was sort of right at his in his late 20s, and so he was using this space in Old Town almost as an experiment, as a lab for how he could do all kinds of artistic work. And then, of course, it was so popular as a space for artists because, frankly, Tower Town was becoming overpriced. So a lot of artists had to move. They found refuge in Old Town in this Burton Place, Carl Street Studios in 1927. And it was so popular that even Edgar Miller and Saul Kogan were asked to do a second project, which is on Wells Street, within the next year. And so rapidly over, the first few years, they were doing 2 projects, and then several other projects got started sort of after the Depression waned in the late 30s. And then more of them started happening. These are other artists, of course. I'm not just saying Edgar Miller. Other artists started to move into the neighborhood in the late 40s and 50s, and they were looking at those buildings on Burton and on Wells and saying, wow, that's really cool. You know, we can take found tile and brick and glass and redo our wall or redo our structure in some way. And if you go to some of the older Old Town homes, you know, a lot of them are being demolished, sadly. But if you go into a lot of them, you'll find these just wild bathrooms with lots of tile, or you see these walls. You've probably seen the walls with the heads of the Garrick Theater. Yep. Busts right on the sidewalk. I mean, that is right in line with that Old Town tradition of taking stuff that's being demolished somewhere and let's turn it into a beautiful wall. And that's just what makes it so special. And so Edgar Miller, did he found Old Town? Not literally, but he was one of the leading artists to really change the makeup of that neighborhood.
Yeah, sort of the spiritual founder in some ways. Yeah. If anybody wants to learn a little bit more about that time, about sort of how that, just the larger story there's a really good book that talks about some of this called The Battle of Lincoln Park, which was written by a local writer named Daniel K. Hertz, who actually works for the city today. I think he's in the Department of Housing. But I read that a couple of years ago, similarly talked about Edgar Miller's role in the early days of Old Town. And I know you had shared the screen just a moment ago, but I wanted to make sure that people saw some of the incredible stuff. I pulled up the architecture tab on the Edgar Miller Legacy site, just so people would take a look at this incredible style. It's absolutely jaw-dropping, even in the photographs here. And I love how eclectic it is, all the different forms and materials. It is an incredibly distinctive look. And I think that's why, like, when I first saw your image, Zac, I was able to just click right away that he must be in an Edgar Miller space, just because there's just nothing else like it in Chicago, in all honesty. And I did want to ask, actually, I'll let this kind of cycle for a minute here so people can admire it. The most famous Edgar Miller sites, I think, are the Carl Street Studios on Burton Place and the Wells Street Studios, which are a couple of blocks away from each other in Old Town. Do you know how many total buildings have work by Edgar Miller, artwork or architecture work by him here in Chicago?
You know, I should really learn what the exact number is. I can quickly just be like, this is the number. But it's definitely a dozen or more buildings. And you have to remember that a lot of the buildings that he did artwork for, like a mural, for instance, many of them have been destroyed, or at least the interiors have been redone. He did a lot of like restaurant murals and things like that. But the main buildings are the 4 handmade homes, the 2 you mentioned in Old Town, and then that picture right there in the middle, actually,
yep.
is the Fisher Studio Apartments on State Street, which I'm sure you've walked by many times, right north of Division, has a curved white facade. And that was a building that he did with Andrew Rabori, a famous architect of Chicago, who's also been somewhat forgotten, and is now a Chicago landmark. That was done in 1936. There's another building on Cleveland, just at Webster in Lincoln Park, called the Walter Guest Apartments. It's in a historic district, so every other home on the street is an older Victorian type home. And then suddenly you see this sort of box of, brick and really stylized brick and glass, kind of like behind me. Beautiful building. That was done in 1932. Then there's, of course, all the work that he did installation-wise, such as like the Northwestern Institute of Technology, which you can go visit and you can walk outside and see his work. That's up on Sheridan Road in Evanston. He did artwork also for the Madonna della Strada Chapel at Loyola. So that's also another Andrew Rabori building. He worked a lot with, his sort of favorite architects would hire him and vice versa. And of course, there's, stained glass at a church in Des Plaines. There's more stained glass at a mausoleum in Oak Ridge. Actually, it's Hillside, but it's called Oak Ridge. And if you have a chance, if you love stained glass, and you have a car and you can get out to the cemetery there, I think you can still just go in. And it is some of the most spectacular stained glass work. And it's not just one window, it's like a dozen windows. And he did the chapel. This is 1928, by the way. So this is when they were like still rolling in it as far as, oh, let's just build a beautiful mausoleum with all this stained glass in it. So the mausoleum ended up actually going under by 1930. So financially speaking, it's still there. It's just, they had to sell it. So there's a lot of work everywhere. And we did have a map, by the way, on our website, which then Google decided to get rid of that program. And we had spent all this time building the map. So now we read it. So it'll come eventually back, and you'll be able to see where each of his sites are.
Yeah. Just in my own experience, wandering around downtown, I came across two of them that I don't think I heard you mention. One of them is in King Arthur's Court at the Intercontinental on the Mag Mile. There's a stained glass display in that, looking right down on Michigan Avenue. And I think he also, didn't he do metalwork for the, I think it's called the Trustees Building, which is right where the Brown Line L enters the loop, like Wells Street and Lake Street.
182 Westlake.
Yeah.
And it's right where the curve of the L is. So at night, actually, if you're on the train, you can look down and see the backlit work. It's actually was called the Trustees Services Systems Building. And it was a bank that provided loans primarily to farmers and to miners, which were, big industries, sort of in the Midwest at the time. And it also went out of business. I think it was finished in 1929. And by 1931 or something, the bank was out of business. But fortunately, that building, has been preserved as a condo building now. And they restored those cut lead windows in the entryway when they did the condo restoration. So really fortunate that those were saved. Edgar Miller did those, by the way, with his sister, Hester Miller Murray. She married another artist here. Anyway, she was really great at doing the lead cutting and doing metal work like that. And they both were, but it was a project that they could sort of tag team and then suddenly, get it done twice as fast. And he did that with a lot of people. He worked with his sister, he worked with his brother, Frank Miller, as well as an assistant Mexican immigrant named Jesus Torres. He did a lot of work with him. And that's, you see some of Miller's work and you go, how did he get all this done? He didn't do it all himself, but he did a lot of it himself. And he was able to also, employ friends that he could work with or family, and get the vision through no matter what.
Yeah. Sort of it takes a village approach to artistic creation almost, which makes sense as the spiritual founder of Old Town, as I will now insist on calling him.
Sure.
So we had a couple of good questions come in here in the past couple of minutes here. I want to make sure we had time to get to them. So you were kind of explaining some of your background there, but Bonnie had asked, how did you in particular wind up being part of Edgar Miller Legacy, wind up being executive director?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I helped to found the organization with a group of other admirers of Edgar Miller around 2014, and it was something that we had been planning to do for a few years. My background actually is in several different places. I've worked in the restaurant and hospitality industry as well as events. I got an MBA at UIC shortly before founding the organization. And the situation sort of arose that it seemed like a good time to start the organization. There were a lot of other different events sort of, coming together. Mm-hmm. And, so I was one of the people who helped to really spearhead the organization and get a lot of these folks who otherwise are what I would, call hobbyists or collectors or preservationists, but not in any formal way, sort of come together and really put their brain trust into this organization. And I just knew that there also needed to be somebody to organize it.
Yeah.
Or oftentimes, things just can't come together. And so that's how I became executive director. And, I love doing this. I also am really hoping we could grow this organization to be sustainable enough that, another person can come in and do it. I have a very, distinct relationship to the history because I grew up around it. And so sometimes I feel a little too close to it. And I wonder if there might be somebody who's more objective to run the organization. But we're not there yet. We're still growing. We have a small board and volunteer base, but we're still growing and looking forward to the future in spite of this current downtime that we have. Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, Michael had asked, and I think you had mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but Michael was asking if Edgar Miller Legacy does any tours. I know you've done that in the past, and it's virtual tours that you're going to be tackling in the immediate future, right?
Right, yeah. So as I mentioned, most of our tours were to private spaces, and so those are going to be hard to get just to make possible right now. What we're working on is a virtual tour of the Glasner Studio, which is Edgar Miller's masterpiece. If you have the book, The Handmade Home, it's the first one that they cover in the photography section. Beautiful space, and really a lot of embedded history as well. So we're gonna turn that into a virtual tour. We might be able to also do a virtual tour, for instance, of some of the courtyards at the studios, and maybe do some other ones of some of these offsites, that are outside of these original handmade homes. And then in terms of, doing live tours, we're such a small organization that right now, the tour program is not our bread and butter. It was a program that was helping to educate people, but we don't want to put folks, in unnecessary risk or anything like that. And we also feel like that we don't necessarily have the capacity to do it correctly. So we're sort of staying it safe as far as that goes, and not doing the live tours until, we're basically told, it's a safer time to do so.
Yeah.
But
we've had a very similar experience this summer with detours, certainly. A couple of quick questions here to finish us up. Bonnie had asked, I think she was responding to something you had mentioned, the Jesus Torres that he had worked with. Did Jesus Torres work at Hull House?
He did. That's actually where they met. So great question. And Jesus Torres, the running theme in the Edgar Miller universe is a lot of artists who were overlooked or, were sort of well known at the time, but have been forgotten by history. And Jesus Torres was a really amazing artist. He actually came to Chicago around 1926 and went to the Hull House to take classes, and was very quickly noticed as an expert ceramicist. Keep in mind, he really didn't have a lot of artistic experience before he came to the Hull House. And the Hull House was a place where they were using art as an educational tool and as a way to help people get a career in art going. And so Jesus Torres, excelled at that and became sort of a star there. And we're not quite sure the exact circumstances, but we know that Edgar Miller was also involved with the Hull House starting around 1917. So he had been in and out of the Hull House and knew Jane Addams and a lot of other folks there, teachers, for many years. And I know he was looking for someone to help with the Carl Street Studios in 1927. And so it's not clear if he knew Torres from before, or if he literally went down there and was like, "We need help. Give us your person." I don't know how that exactly worked yet. There may be more information, hidden in some manuscript somewhere that he wrote that down. But in any case, Torres came and worked at the Carl Street Studios and really worked with Miller and Saul Kogan separately beyond that, and developed his own career doing interiors, for many years after that. And you can really trace that his education in craft work, like heavy craft work, woodwork, metalwork and stuff, to Edgar Miller. It's not clear that he was really doing that work until Edgar brought him to the Carl Street Studios, but he was such a natural that, from the Hull House to there, and then, you know, became a successful artist, which was pretty remarkable for a Mexican immigrant in Chicago in the 1930s. So, you know.
That's fantastic. And Bonnie, who had asked that question, was saying she's a ceramics curator, so she was familiar with Torres, but didn't know that connection. That's really neat. One last question, then we'll wrap things up here. Bonnie, who's not in the Chicago area, I think is asking out of her own sense of curiosity and exploration here. Did Edgar Miller do any work, much work outside of Chicago?
True. Yes, he did. Mostly did work in and around Chicago, but he definitely did work. There's a beautiful mural at the Pabst Blue Ribbon Hall in Milwaukee, at the Best Place. You can go visit that and see Miller's murals of the history of brewing there, which is really interesting. He did a couple murals in New York City for 2 hotels that I believe are now gone. Not the hotels, but the murals. We tried to track them down, but they don't exist anymore. He did artwork for the entire Statler Hotel in Washington, D.C. in 1943, I think, or 41. Sadly, all that work was also yanked, and we don't know what happened to it. But, you know, that's what happens with hotels, is they redo themselves every 20 years, and I think that's what happened there. And he went all over the country. I mean, he did work in Denver, in Los Angeles, and St. Louis. Again, a lot of this work was mural work. You know, it was something he could just get on the train, go do a mural for a week or 2, get paid, and come back. The big installation work was usually with a big architecture firm called Halliburton Root.
Oh, sure.
Knew them well. And he did, so the Statler, for instance, that was a Halliburton Root building, and he was brought out there to do, you know, not just painting, but sculptural work and things like that. He also did the work for the North Dakota State Capitol in Bismarck. So if you're ever out that way, you should go stop at the Capitol and take the tour, and you will see all of Edgar Miller's installation and design work there. It's really an incredible Capitol building. It's completely modern.
Yeah, it's the Art Deco tower, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Art Deco, almost like pre-brutalism kind of.
Yeah. I was bored on Twitter a couple of weeks ago and created a thread where I posted photos and judged state capitol buildings and then like national capitol buildings. I had a weird couple of days there.
Well, his work there, and one thing that should be mentioned is that Edgar and his friends like Halliburton Root at that time really believed that modern architecture and design was the way to go forward, but it should always be sort of softened with artistic installation. So it's a style of building that unfortunately was sort of lost after World War II and the rise of like Mies, you know, international style brutalism, things like that, that sort of just said the artwork, why do we need that? And so Edgar Miller's career really took a different turn after, you know, the 50s. He pretty much did a lot of illustrative work or like home designs or things for small projects. But his last major work was actually for the Gypsum building, which was demolished, unfortunately, in the 90s, I believe, or in the early 2000s. But the US Gypsum building, he did these huge installed bas-reliefs in the lobby. That was his last major work of sort of an installation like that. Also probably not saved.
That is unfortunate, but we're very happy to have you with us this evening. Zac, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us. Hopefully this is a nice introduction to Edgar Miller for everybody. I'm afraid my video may have frozen up there. Well, at least it waited until the end of our time together to do that. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I'm getting that back. Anyway, thank you all for being with us this evening. I hope you all enjoyed hearing from Zac, enjoyed hanging out with us this summer. Of course, sorry you can't see my face, but I am smiling. I am waving. Cheers to all of you, of course, for being with us this evening. And as always, check in on us at Chicago Detours. We've got some special events coming up, and you can always track along with us on social media to catch up on what we've got coming forward. And of course, we'll do our best to amplify Zac's work with Edgar Miller Legacy as well. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.